We're happy to have you back. And for our newcomers, we're excited to have you here with us today for the first time. In this episode, we're going to illustrate how feedback practices have evolved over the years and the positive impact it can have on your organization's culture change. Now, as I quickly share some housekeeping notes, drop in the chat or comments where you're joining in from today. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is also going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned with today's conversation. And we suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps so you can really get the most out of today's discussion. And it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments with us in the chat. Now, to get this show underway, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. An Aussie-turned New Yorker who coined the term neuroleadership when he co-founded NLI over 2 decades ago. With a professional doctorate, 4 successful books under his name, and a multitude of bylines, ranging from the Harvard Business Review to the New York Times and many more, a warm welcome to the co-founder and CEO of the Neuroleadership Institute, Dr. David Rock. Thanks for being here today, David.
Thanks, Shelby. Great to be back.
Great to have you. And our moderator for today is the Director of Research at the Neuroleadership Institute, where she focuses on translating cognitive and social neuroscience into actionable solutions for organizations, as well as helps communicate relevant research in an accessible manner for the public. Previously, she was a professor at Dominican College and New York University and a researcher at the Nathan Klein Institute. She holds a bachelor's degree from Brown University and a PhD in neuroscience from New York University. A warm welcome to the Director of Research at NLI, Dr. Emma Sarro. Thanks for being here today, Emma, and I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Shelby. Hey, David, nice to be here with you again.
Definitely. Great. Look forward to this conversation. It's a really rich one.
Yeah. And actually, for all of you here, it's not just us today. We do have a surprise guest joining us towards the end. So if you're patient with us, you'll get to see who it is. But that's just a little teaser. We've been doing a lot of work around leadership and those essential skills that leaders need to get the most out of their team for anyone who's been following us. One of the areas that we've been thinking about is how we manage the performance of our team. And in fact, there seems to be a lot of renewed energy around performance management again, taking into account this new steady state that we're finding ourselves in around hybrid work and the need for even more agility and accountability. And actually, a recent Gallup report finds that only 18% of U.S. employees consider their organizations agile. So we've always anchored on performance management generally being around conversations that you're having, not necessarily the tech that you put in place. And we've talked about these as being 6 main conversations. So these conversations are your check-in conversations, goal setting, end of cycle, compensation, and career conversations. And last but not least, the feedback conversations, which we feel are the most important ones for continued and sustained improvement. And so this one is the one that we're focusing on today. And I'll just start this off a bit and ask David, why do you think feedback is the most important type of conversation?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at sort of the tonnage of conversations people have. Like if you actually could like have a stopwatch that went on and off automatically, maybe an AI when a manager had some kind of performance conversation with their team, right? If you do goal setting really right, it's like 15 minutes a year or maybe half an hour a year, right? If you do the check-ins really right, maybe it's an hour a year across 3 or 4 check-ins, right? If you do a comp conversation, it should be about 15 minutes. If you do a career conversation, maybe it's half an hour to an hour. But if you're doing feedback right, it's actually many hours, and it's something that really should be happening weekly or certainly a few times every month when it's right. So if you sort of look at the kind of best practice for the 4 conversations, it's really the feedback is the one that should be really woven into the day-to-day practices of people, and probably 20, 30, 40 times as much tonnage of time and energy as the other ones. But that's usually not the case. Usually it's nowhere near that. So as well as being sort of should be the biggest, it also probably has the biggest gap in terms of sort of how much people could get and want and how much they get. So we've surveyed people a lot, like, how much really useful feedback do you get that actually helps you like really grow? And let's ask the community here, how many times a week, or let's say how many times a month just to keep it sort of consistent, how many times a month in your role would you get some kind of feedback or have a conversation with someone that actually helps you do better? Maybe you're coding better, maybe you're building presentations better now, maybe you're running meetings better. But how many times a month? So if it's weekly, maybe say 4 times a month, just put in the chat, how many times a month would you get feedback that actually helps you get better? So Marianne is saying twice a month, saying 4 times a month. Not often, unless I ask for it once a year. There we go, 4 to 6 times a month, maybe once. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, keep putting them in there. How many times a month? So maybe once a month, 0, thanks. Maybe once. So pretty low. There's one person constantly. Fantastic. Love it. Hardly ever. So it's really interesting when if you're to study like the way people just work, again, if you were just to like film people and like record and watch, if you could know like how many times people were unsure about what they did, if you could sort of see inside the employee's head and say, how many times a month are they unsure and they wish they could have some information? It's really every day. And if you ask the managers, how many times, a month do you wish you could say something? It's like, oh my gosh, I wish almost every day, I wish I could say something to my employee. So you've got this weird dynamic, right? Of people really want feedback. People really want to give it. There's a massive gap. It's really interesting. So
and I would say, I mean, I would also ask the audience again, because I think it comes down to like the challenges we face when we even think about giving feedback. So when you think about like, I need to give feedback to my team member, like what are those initial thoughts that are coming up, especially if the feedback is going to be constructive feedback, to help them get better at something. And at the same time, kind of like the flip side of that is, how does it feel when someone comes to you and says, I need to give you feedback? So
well, that's 2 questions. Give people one. Let's give people one question.
Okay. Well, the first one, how do you feel when you have to give feedback?
Right. What does it feel like when you need to give feedback? What's the experience for you? Be curious. Let's throw that in the chat. What does it feel like for you when you need to give feedback? Thanks, Antonia. Awkward. How does it feel? And we'll come back to this fact a little bit. Expecting defensiveness. Thanks, Misty. How does it feel like? It depends. Yep. Stressful. I do it daily, so an opportunity varies. Anxiety ridden, uncomfortable, pressure to do it right. Dollars doesn't work, so it's depressed.
Listening.
Yeah, it depends a lot. It does depend, of course, on the kind of feedback and on who and the relationship and all those things. But on average, there's some anxiety, right? And I think it's the degree of anxiety. It could be very mild anxiety, like, oh, I hope this goes okay, like a mild level 1. If you've got a great relationship, it might be a mild level 1 threat. If there's some issues, it might be a level 2 threat. And if like there's some real issues, it might be a level 3 threat, which is, you might feel overwhelmed by it. So there's a lot of different emotions there in the situation. But someone brought up a point there. I think it's important that in a world where things are more hybrid, we actually need to have more feedback conversations. And I think this is a really important point. Emma mentioned earlier about sort of there's a renewed focus on performance management, right? And I want to just make a point about that. Like, definitely we're in a more of a steady state around hybrid. So maybe if your company's all back in the office, it's not as different, but most companies, there's a mix of in and out of the office, some kind of hybrid. In that world, performance management is really different when you're not seeing people all the time, and you actually need a lot more conversations. And they need to kind of be set up and scheduled, or they don't happen because you don't get the natural conversation. So there's this whole like additional focus on how do we do performance management in a hybrid world. And we keep being asked that by companies, and the answer we keep coming back to is you really want to get this feedback piece right, because it's not really about the end of year thing or the quarterly thing. It's actually about the flow day to day, week to week. And so you really need to get this feedback stuff right. So that the flow of work is really right week to week. If you're not seeing someone and things go astray, you don't want to find that out in a quarter. So that's something that we saw. And then there's also this really accelerated focus on agility, given AI and other technologies. People are just like, wow, we need to be much more agile. And a big piece of that is like giving feedback and people knowing how they're doing and changing goals and changing strategies and all this stuff. So basically you need richer communication.
And I think what's coming up for me now is just that then you also don't want to cross over the line of being like of surveying your team at the same time. I mean, how often do you check in to make sure they're kind of on track? So you don't really want to cross that line either. So how do you
Yeah.
kind of balance that?
Yeah, and the third theme that we're seeing, there's the hybrid work, there's the sort of agility, and the third thing is accountability. Is that companies everywhere are saying, look, we've got all this pressure on us to do less with more. We really need to know people are delivering. And again, like the best way to do that is in a conversation you're having constantly, not in an end of month or end of quarter. So for all three reasons, it feels like there's this renewed interest in in feedback. It's become really important.
Yeah, and this is renewed. I mean, we've been in this field for a long time thinking about feedback. And maybe at the beginning were the reasons the same? So when did you start jumping into feedback?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's actually been one of those things that's always been an issue. So I remember like we started in 1998. I know I'm aging myself. Like 1998 is like an entire century ago. So the business started, and the first thing that we did as a company was we were training executive coaches, and we started then doing some organizations came to us and said, can you help us turn our managers into coaches? And so we started doing in-house coaching programs, building coaches. It was really profoundly powerful even then. And then the next thing that happened is companies said, well, the biggest challenge we have is actually people can't give feedback. And so all the way back in about the year 2000, it's literally 24 years ago, we started building feedback trainings. And I look back at those, I've still got the decks. I'm a hoarder. I'm a digital hoarder. I looked back at the decks just recently, and there's a lot we actually had right. Although our point of view is massively evolved, but it's evolved, not changed. It's on the same path. And the path we had right back then was feedback causes a threat. Feedback makes people really uncomfortable. And if you don't do something about that threat, the feedback doesn't really do anything. And so we had these different ways, before we even had SCARF, of like introducing, threat reducing conversations and, asking questions instead of telling people and all this stuff. So it actually was about the first thing that we did with companies. Literally 24 years ago, was these, feedback programs, and we scaled them quite a bit, and they had quite a good result. But it still continued to be something that, like, really, really over that whole 24 years, it's continued to be something that's like the hardest kind of nut to crack. And really hard to know exactly how to like fix this. And then along came this opportunity with Microsoft. I guess it was about 7 years ago now, and it was a really interesting opportunity. They basically said, they gave us this kind of dream project. They said, look, we've been running feedback programs for 15, 20 years, and nothing seems to change. And we're like, wow, we've been running them a lot. They seem to be really popular, but it's still really a problem, like, as well. They're like,
so figure it out.
There's like, what do we know in the science that can change this conundrum? Like, what can we learn from science that really changes this situation, so we can actually like teach people well, and then it's fixed, right? Like, can we fix this problem? And we're like, it's a great research project. We started working on it, and look, it's a long story. I could spend an hour just explaining the study we did. We did a lot. The cliff note is we studied 35 different feedback models. So like the feedback sandwich is one, it's like, be nice, deliver feedback, be nice again. So we studied 35 different models that we thought, from what we could find online and everything, were the most dominant feedback models. And what we studied, what we were looking for is kind of categorizing them. Do any of them look like they really work? Is there any evidence? Is there any academic evidence that they work? Which one from academic research has been studied? And what we found was it was just unbelievably noisy. There was no signal. It's just no signal at all. There was no feedback model that stood out as like really the one to use and that really worked best. They were just different. And they were all essentially doing the same kind of thing, which was really scary. They were all like dancing around the fact that feedback is really uncomfortable, but not really doing anything about it. It was sort of like, don't make it personal, take it away. But people take it personally. So we looked at that. You can't change that. The second thing we did was we looked at what all the actual academics today think about it. So we interviewed a big group of academics, the heads of business schools. We interviewed about 6 different Ivy League business school heads who, would teach this stuff and study this stuff. And there was no signal there. It was terrifying. I won't terrify you how scary those conversations were. But the cliff note was like, we had to teach something. So we teach this. We don't really think it works, but we're teaching it. So I'm like, These are the future CEOs of the world you're teaching, and you literally don't teach them how to give feedback. Amazing. So then so nothing was sort of working. Oh, then we did a literature review way back, like literally 100 years. Like, what is there in the literature? We really studied that, and our team synthesized and digested and looked at like everything that we know about feedback. And we tried to synthesize that. And we are like world leading synthesizers. That's something that we do. We're the Rollins H101 of synthesizers.
There's lots of material into something very simple.
Yeah, it's a music joke for people in the music space. But the synthesizer, like the synthesizing process, like we're really good at finding like even very subtle patterns. And we just couldn't find a pattern in all the literature. There was nothing. It was really blowing us away. And then I had this idea, like it seemed so obvious and dumb at the time. I said, why don't we look at what happens in the brain when feedback actually works and see if we can deconstruct like a mental model for how to do feedback based on like the brain. Like, let's look at what happens there. And so we interviewed a bunch of scientists and we did a bunch of research, and we found that there was a process, and it was a very simple process. And the basic concept was, for feedback to work, there was a moment that happened in it. It sounds a little bit like an insight moment, but it's a particular kind of insight. But it does release energy. It has similarities to insight. It does release energy. It does create motivation. It does change the brain. But it's a certain kind of insight. It's essentially, you have to do this thing called mental contrasting, which is basically holding two complex ideas in mind at the same time and comparing them, right? And lots has been written about mental contrasting, the ability to hold two different ideas and not explode your brain and, all this stuff. Like an example of that is that people are bad at is if you've got two bad options in a scenario, people just can't think about them because they just don't like bad options because but sometimes you need to think about two bad options, and it's sort of hard to do, and it takes some cognitive gymnastics. In a similar way, when someone gives you feedback, let's say about the way you run meetings, for it to actually be useful, you've got to hold in real time in your working memory, like doing math, you've got to hold a picture of the way you currently run meetings. That picture will involve a huge map of memories of all the meetings you've run, all the books you've read, all the good meetings, bad meetings. But you've got to activate this mental map in working memory and across the brain, the way you run meetings. And then you've got to create a mental map based on the feedback someone's giving you. Like, why don't you let other people run them? Or why don't you do them in 25 minutes instead? Or why don't you do them this way? You got to create this mental map, this picture of the other way of doing it, and actually picture it and actually compare it to the first picture. And this is mental contrasting. And I'm going slowly, sort of trying to help you picture it, because it's basically a really difficult thing to do. And what happens is anything, like it's like doing long division in your head. Some of you actually remember what long division is. It's like doing long division in your head, where you sort of got this step, then this step, then this step, then this step, and anything that comes along and interrupts you start again. Now, the problem is the thing that comes along and interrupts you constantly when someone gives you feedback is basically this thought, why are you telling me this? Who are you to tell me this? This isn't fair. You basically have a status threat and a fairness threat, maybe an autonomy threat. You're having all this threat response, and your brain's basically like trying to deflect. And this threat response takes away oxygen and glucose from the network you need to mentally contrast, right? So this is what happens. So basically we saw, look, you need a lot of cognitive resources to mentally contrast. And basically the act of like having a feedback conversation significantly reduces those. And this explains why, someone will give you feedback, and 6 months later, when you're not upset anymore, you'll be able to think about it and you'll go, oh, maybe they were right, Yeah. So anyway, that's what we saw. So basically we saw, look, we said, look, any model that doesn't significantly reduce feedback, sorry, the threat of feedback isn't going to work. And this explains. So we said, well, what actually reduces the threat response? And what we found was there was only one thing that really reduced the threat response, really. And that was actually not to have a feedback conversation the way they actually work. Like literally, don't give someone feedback, you won't create threat. And we're like, and to Nancy's point, like, don't call it feedback. That helps as well. But people can tell when you're like calling it something else. Let me share my perspective on how you messed up. They can still tell. So we thought, well, what is it you could do and that actually doesn't create threat. And that we realized the only thing that you could do is if you actually ask for feedback, instead of receiving it. If the person on the receiving end actually asks for it, instead of a status threat of like, oh my gosh, someone sent me something, it actually is a little bit of a status reward, like you're looking, like you're interested, you're smart. It's an overall leaning in like response. You're like asking for something. That's an autonomy reward. So like you're actually sort of asking in the fact that you're asking, you're creating an autonomy reward. It's a little bit more certain for you as well. And you're not feeling like this person's like attacking you or against you because you're asking. So it's a relatedness reward. So in all these ways, it turns down the threat response a lot, maybe not completely, but it turns it down a lot. So we had this big aha. We ran back to Microsoft and said, we think we have the answer. Don't give feedback. They were like, what? Don't give feedback? So that's what happened. So with Microsoft, we then developed a framework. We called it Perspectives, and we launched that a few years ago. Now it's rolled out. We then built that for Accenture. They developed Well Better Next with us. That's gone to like a million people or something now. We helped IBM build this approach. We've helped maybe 300 or 400 different companies kind of build an approach based on asking. So that was the really big insight. And what we found was that that if you teach people to ask well, folks give feedback well. But if you just teach people to ask, if you just say, hey, go and ask for feedback, it actually doesn't go well. Because other people say, I like your shoes. You look good today. So it's not just, and we sort of learned this pretty quickly. It's not just asking, but you need to ask well. And so the training is not in actually giving feedback well. The training we found is in asking for feedback well. And the interesting thing that happens is when someone, especially a manager, asks for feedback well, other people ask back. And that creates a really powerful, dynamic there. So that's kind of the Microsoft story. And then, we ended up launching a solution called Improve, that's still, really helpful, powerful solution out there that literally walks people through how to ask well on feedback. So anyway, that's the story. Someone's asking about, Microsoft, it's called Microsoft Perspectives. You can actually Google that. You'll see all about it, Microsoft Perspectives. It wasn't branded at IBM, and it was just kind of woven into the fabric of what they did. But Accenture, it's called Well Better Next. So what you do well, what could you do better in the future, and what is there to do next? So any questions or comments coming up in the chat? Emma, anything that you see? And folks, if you have any sort of questions, let's take a pause for a minute and we'll see what's coming up there.
We're getting lots of questions, but one question I think we will end up addressing at some point is if you really need to give feedback to someone, but they're not asking for it. And I know that comes up as we kind of go along our conversation, but what would you initially think about that?
It's a really important question. And, we've been like attuned to like, give feedback. We've all been through these training programs. You've got to give lots of feedback. I actually know of one company that operationalized requiring managers to give feedback every week. Like they had to like tick a box and report and all this stuff. The company literally ground to a halt. Like it ended up doing incredibly badly. And it was an Australian company, not here anymore, and it really didn't work. So it's really interesting. But if you there are definitely times that you need to just give feedback, right? And the overall question is, how do you do it so it's as little threatening as possible, right? Creates the least stress response in the other person. And the answer to that will vary, but generally, if you can get the person to feel like they have a choice, they've got some autonomy, that will help. So in the coaching world, when we've trained our coaches stuff, we call it permission. Like before you have a coaching conversation, just check in. I have a really close friend. I love him to death, but he's often just like giving me unsolicited coaching, like when I'm not ready. It's like, hang on, just like before you just jump in and do that, I'm not ready, So, but if you checked with me, like, hey, is this a good time to talk about this? I'd be like, yeah, okay. And that makes a big difference. So this act of choosing is really powerful. So this first thing would be like, hey, I have a conversation that I'd like to have with you. Is now a good time? The second thing is create a little bit of certainty, because as soon as you hear that, you go, oh my God, I'm fired, right? So I'll always say like, hey, you're doing okay overall. I promise your job's not at stake. And it's just about this project or this thing. So a little bit of permission, which creates an autonomy response, a little bit of certainty, right, which reduces that uncertainty, that panic. And then people's minds will be much open. And then the third thing is, if you can, use a question, because we've actually studied this, not super formally, but we collected data over quite a lot of workshops, and we found that when given a chance, about 3/4 of the time, people will know actually what the gap was and what they did wrong and what they should do differently. In other words, when someone's messed up a project, if you tell them, hey, you messed up the project this way, they'll tend to argue with you. But if you say, hey, what are your thoughts on what you would do differently if you're doing this next time? About 3/4 of the time, people are really insightful and really correct about the way they messed up and what they need to do. And so sort of a little bit of permission, a little bit of we call it placement or context of sort of where you're coming from, remove their fears. And then if you can, try and ask it as a question. Now, that doesn't always work. Sometimes you just got to say, hey, the way you organize that spreadsheet just wasn't really optimal. Can you try it this way? That's fine. You've given them, you've softened the blow. But sort of the more likely it's to be threatening, the more you want to do really permission, really a bit of context, and then ask questions, because about 3/4 of the time, it'll be much less painful for you. So that's what we found when you need to kind of give feedback that way. What else is coming up for you? And folks, feel free to ask some questions before I guess we can dig into the research study we did a bit as well.
Yeah, which is one of my favorite things. But what's coming up for me is just the idea of the power of the social rewards. I mean, we've just been throwing out all of these different kinds of social rewards that you can, the SCARF model, it's amazing. And just by asking, you're giving that choice, which is why asking for feedback is so powerful. You're giving the person like the first step towards improving. And as we know, we all want, and we all need that feedback, and we all want to improve. So just giving that option to take the first step is enough to kind of like handle whatever is coming your way, that like potential threat or potential constructive criticism.
Yeah, and someone's mentioning SCARF. SCARF is definitely a framework to remind you to like send those positive responses around, particularly autonomy and status and certainty. Gives you a really helpful tool to think about it. Yeah, but let's talk about the study, I think, and then we'll introduce our special guest. So a really fun thing that happened is we were super passionate about this research. We were working at the time with as I said, Microsoft, Accenture, and others, and we were working with, at the time, a big accounting firm in Australia, and we had a really good partnership with the CHRO there, the head of people, and it was a big firm. And she said, "Oh, I love this feedback stuff. Can we study it? Can we do a study together?" And we do this now and again. We'll do a joint study with a company to kind of explore an idea. And we set up this really formal lab in her offices. And again, this is a big company, thousands of people. We've got roughly 100 people volunteering to do the study. And without going into the detail of it, what we basically did was we set up a game that they played. And then after that, they would basically give each other feedback. And in certain conditions, they would ask for feedback, and otherwise they would just give it. One person would give it, and then they did another task, a second task, right, that they would have to do together. And so we collected all this really rich data that was behavioral of what happened and all this stuff and who performed better and why. But we also collected biodata, so heart rate variability, all this other stuff. And it took us like a year or so to run this project and collect the data and explore it. And we discovered some amazing things. The first thing that was really interesting was we discovered we confirmed our suspicion that feedback causes a threat response, but we actually were able to put like a sort of schema to it. We found that the threat response was about as strong as going for a run. In other words, if you're receiving feedback, if someone says, "Can I give you feedback?" In this case, it was just about a sort of trivial game, right? It would be worse in real life. But even on a trivial game, when someone says, "Can I give you feedback?" the person receiving that, their heart rate goes up a lot. And on average, it was different between people, but on average, it was about like you just gone for a run. So a lot. The second thing that was really fascinating, and we kind of alluded to this in the first question we asked you, is that the person giving feedback, they had the same or stronger threat response. Isn't that interesting? They had the same or stronger threat response. And this explains a lot. This explains like why people avoid giving feedback, why it comes out so weird, why it's awkward, is that the giver of feedback really does have a strong threat response. And again, even even in an environment that's really relatively trivial. And then The third thing that was really amazing is that in the conditions where someone asked, we found that the threat for both giver and receiver, the threat for both sides reduced a lot. It reduced about 50%. And again, there was, variation between people, but roughly it was about half as stressful for the giver and half as stressful for the receiver. That was like, wow, that's amazing. It's not like 5% or 10 or 20, it was 50% less stressful. And so this really confirmed our suspicions and got us really on the path of like kind of building this and really defining this. We wrote a piece on this in Strategy and Business, I think called Using Neuroscience to Make Feedback Work or something. My team can put that in the chat so you can sort of read more about it. But the study was amazing. We ended up publishing 2 academic papers on this. And then we built a solution called Improve that literally teaches this, and all that happened. Just, before we change topics and take questions, while we're on that, if anyone's interested and you're from a company and you're interested in exploring the Improve solution, just put the word Improve in the chat. And maybe your company name, just put Improve in your company name, and someone will follow up with you in the next week. Just in case you're interested in that. So moving on. Anyway, that was the study, and we did that some time ago. I think 2015, 2016, we published it. So it's a while ago now, but it's still like super relevant and super important. So yeah, Emma, what's coming up for you? What do you want to dig into there?
Yeah, well, one of the results that I think is most amazing, on top of the fact that asking reduces kind of the stress level on both sides by half, is just that we did ask individuals to kind of play like a collaborative game afterwards. And the performance of those pairs was much better when they had this asking for feedback conversation. So that reduced stress actually helped them to work better together afterwards. So you can imagine that if you're regularly asking for feedback with each other, then your ability to work better together afterwards has hugely improved.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions about neurodivergent folks and feedback. And I think, as a general rule, and it's, neurodivergence is really broad as a term. There's a lot of people with quite different kinds of needs there, right? And we sort of categorize it as in 3 ways. There are definitely folks with very specific needs that need accommodations because they're highly neurodivergent, maybe maybe on an autism spectrum or some other spectrum. We tend to sort of think about those, but about something like 30 to 50% of all employees have mental health challenges that need some kind of accommodation. And high anxiety, could be depression, could be all sorts of things. So it's a really big population. Really do better with some kind of accommodation. And then you've got sort of the whole population where basically everyone actually processes the world really differently. And so there's kind of that type of neurodivergence. But if we're focusing on sort of the first category that I mentioned of people who really need some kind of accommodation, definitely like the autonomy factor is going to make a big difference. Like essentially what's happening with those people is that it's easier to stress them. Like it's easier for them to have a stress response. Smaller things can create a larger stress response, right? So what you want to do there is kind of go even further down the path that I was saying of like really checking that it's a good time to have that conversation, really asking that it's okay to do it, even asking what's the best way they want the information. Like, do you want it in writing? Do you want a conversation? Do you want to ask questions of me? Right? Do you want to tell me what you like? Giving that person more and more control of the experience and really feeling like you're on the same side of the table as them. So you're sort of just going further down that path that I was explaining in that way. Very good. What else is coming up for you in the chat, Emma, before we go to our surprise guest?
So Courtney asked in our question is any research as to the timing or like context, the place where feedback is best received. So we cover that a bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the general principle is do everything you can to reduce the threat response, the likelihood of a threat response, right? The likelihood of a threat response. So generally, when do we have a threat response, right? When do we get anxious? And think about it. It's like when we're already overwhelmed, right? So when our cognitive resources are already sort of taxed, what happens is there's a lot of noise and asynchrony across the prefrontal. The network for controlling emotions is in the prefrontal. It's the brain's braking system at the ventrolateral prefrontal. So anything that sort of, anytime your brain's kind of already overwhelmed, which means you've got fewer resources for prefrontal, you're probably going to accidentally get more anxious. So that includes overwhelm, but also includes being tired, when you're really tired, It includes if you're sick. It includes also if you're already upset about something else. So it's really sort of any time that the people are not well resourced, and not well resourced means this network for conscious processing is diminished. So what does that mean? Don't have the conversation like on a Wednesday afternoon when someone's overwhelmed, right? Maybe a Friday afternoon when they have a second wind is better. Don't have it when people are already upset. And look at the environment. Like, are people calm where they are? Do you need to take a walk, right? Sometimes the best feedback conversations are actually taking a walk with someone and having a conversation, because the walking actually calms the brain and reduces the emotions and reduces distractions. So the environment matters, but their general state of mind matters. So the dominant factor is what helps them be resourced so they don't accidentally, get that threat response.
Yeah. So again, working with their own autonomy, asking them what's best for them, and working with the way that their capacity is, makes a lot of sense. Also, one more question from Stuart is, he's asking about whether this feedback ties back to known intrinsic goals, what the direct report is most passionate about.
Yeah, I mean, this is about like minimizing that threat response, right? So again, the way you minimize the threat response, one way is kind of don't give people negatives. Like, don't say, you're an idiot. That addresses that's a status threat. But the other thing is create positives, right? And one of the ways that we create positives is with aligning on shared goals, right? So a shared goal creates relatedness, the R in SCARF, right? For those new, it's status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So when you feel like you have a shared goal with someone, when you're triangulating on the same thing, both looking at the same thing, it creates a strong reward response in the form of feeling like you're on the same team, that you can trust this person, they've got your back, all these kinds of things. So if you can start a feedback conversation with triangulating and putting attention on, goals you both share, and particularly goals that matter to that person, you're creating a strong toward response. And that's going to turn down the likelihood of threat. So all of these things, you can kind of see how they're either reducing the chance of a threat or increasing the reward side. And in all sorts of different ways. So that's a really good one.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been through this study. We've talked about like our major findings. So synthesizing all of that, what do we typically say are like the 4 main reasons why we need to ask for feedback or create this culture of asking for feedback?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we go right back to where we started. People just don't get anywhere near enough of it, right? Like, there's maybe 3 or 4 people in the chat out of 100 comments that said, I'm getting plenty. There was more than 100 people saying, there's a big gap. So the first one is just to get a lot more feedback. And as whether you're a manager or an individual contributor, actually knowing how you're doing and being able to course correct like weekly is amazing, right? You literally grow faster, you perform better. So the first reason, just to get a lot more feedback so you can actually perform better, right? And not just fix problems, but just do better. Like, so many times, I'll see the way someone does something. I'll be like, I wish I could tell them, to write more clearly, right? But I can't if we don't have a feedback culture. It's too uncomfortable. So if you're asking, you just get a lot more feedback. The second reason, this is really important, is you can actually get unbiased feedback or less biased feedback. Because the problem with receiving it when you receive it is you basically receive it from people who are really, really upset with you now. So generally, we don't give feedback until we're actually really upset with someone. And it's a bit like the internet. The internet's just full of like negative reviews, not many positive reviews for everything, pretty much, because people go in and express their opinion when they're finally upset and they're worked up. Negative is stronger than positive. So the second reason to be asking for feedback, other than just get a lot of it, is actually get richer, more accurate, less biased feedback. And if you're just waiting, you just get it from sort of annoyed people or your boss. But if you want to know like how to run the best possible customer presentation, you want to ask, you don't just want to like wait till your boss happens to tell you. You actually want to ask lots of different people every time you do a presentation, really. Like, that's the optimal. And if you ask one person, what you'll notice is that it's just kind of their perspective. You ask 2 people, you ask 3 people. Once you get to 4 or 5 people, you see that pretty much all feedback is massively tinged by the person's own experiences. But once you ask 4 or 5 people, you start to see a bit of a theme. And so it's really important to ask a lot of people and this question. And I've applied this to like medical issues. Like if I've got a really serious medical issue, I don't go to one doctor. I'm going to go to 3 to 5 doctors because there's so much bias and sort of history for them in their answers. No offense to doctors, but it's see this every single time. So in a similar way, if you ask 3 to 5 people on anything that's important, you actually get really interesting data now. Now you actually see the pattern. But one person will comment on your fonts, another person will comment on your on the slides and the visuals, and another person will comment on something else. But you'll notice that all of them have this theme of like maybe tell more stories or maybe slow down or something, right? So until you ask 3 to 5 people, you don't really see that. So now the reason is to actually get unbiased feedback that's accurate. And if you don't ask, you'll never get that. So to get lots of it, to get it unbiased, the next reason is to actually get feedback on the things that you need feedback on, right? Like if you're trying to improve your customer presentations, ask about that, right? And ask specifically, and so it's a bunch of reasons like that. And essentially at the end of the day, it's like, if you don't ask, you get rare, biased, mostly unhelpful charged feedback. And if you ask, frequently and broadly, right, of people, lots of different people who ask frequently and ask specifically, what you find is that every week you're getting really helpful, unbiased feedback, and you're actually your performance is accelerating. So this is, companies say to me all the time, what do we do about performance management? I say, forget everything, get this one thing right. Like get everyone actually asking for feedback well and giving feedback reasonably in response. And that's what accelerates performance, because now you go from every employee getting random feedback every few months to everyone getting multiple really helpful feedback points every week. To me, that's what accelerates performance. That's what accelerates accountability, agility, and performance overall. So that's why I think this is the number one thing for really creating change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see it reducing the number of times you'll have to have those performance gap conversations or those difficult conversations, because performance is improving along the way. People are fixing their mistakes along the way, and you'll reduce the chances of having to have those tough conversations. Yeah, definitely powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions coming up that we want to address there?
Yeah, well, Brenda asked about the alignment between explicit or implicit or implied expectations. So like people are not always clear about what's expected of them. So how does this kind of like feed into this idea?
Yeah, this is a really, really important one. So we're really bad, managers are really bad at delegating as a whole. And we had a session on this a few weeks ago. There are kind of three traps that people fall into around delegating. Maybe we can put that in here. And the one trap is kind of over like basically micromanaging, right? So a lot of people give just like too much information, but that just makes people have a threat response, an autonomy threat. And you're being too prescriptive, like it's leaving no space for people to make decisions. And now the feedback is going to be, you didn't do it exactly the way I wanted, right? But people don't do things exactly the way your brain sees them. People do things the way their brain sees things, and you got to leave space. So that's really complicated. So if you're giving too much information, too prescriptive, micromanaging, it really doesn't work, and feedback will be really difficult then. The other way of giving feedback is managing by abdication, we call it, which is like just basically telling people nothing, not giving them any clear expectations, and just kind of hoping that that things will work out. And a lot of people with high autonomy needs themselves as managers do that. They kind of just don't tell people much at all and hope they'll succeed. And now feedback's really tough. They've no clear expectations. How do you give feedback when you really weren't clear on what was expected of them? So those are sort of two ends of the continuum. The ideal thing is you give pretty high certainty, but good autonomy. So what that means is you're as a manager, you're telling people really what you're expecting of them, but you're focusing on the outcomes, not on exactly every step on how to get there. So you're like, this is what the quality looks like. Here's an example of another proposal that is the quality we need. Actually, here's 3 examples, so you don't anchor on exactly the way to do one. Here's 3 really high quality proposals of different kinds. That's the quality that we're looking for, but you can decide how you get there, right? So it's high certainty and high autonomy, high certainty of the outcome, high autonomy of the process. Now you can give really rich feedback of how close to the outcome are you, right? And where do you think the gaps are? So we think that high certainty, high autonomy dimension is where you can now give the richest feedback. And that's a really important one.
Yeah. Awesome. We're getting a ton of great questions. I know we have to let our special guest in soon, but one more question from Lisa. If you're asking for feedback in a culture that doesn't ask, how do you not come across as having low confidence in your work? How do you not come across?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, so this habit of asking for feedback actually sort of crosses over two really interesting domains. To Don's question, this is actually the strongest power tool for creating a growth mindset culture. So when you ask for feedback, you're actually creating a growth mindset culture, especially as a manager. If you ask your team and really listen to what they're saying, you're really creating a trusting environment. But it also crosses over psychological safety, that when you ask for feedback, you're actually creating safety for people to give you feedback and safety for them to ask you. So it's really powerful. It kind of achieves both things. Now, the thing with this is you don't want to say, oh, I don't really have any idea what I'm doing as a manager, so, can you tell me how to do better, right? That would be sort of fake humility. You want to have what's called situational humility, which is like, hey, I'm working as a manager right now on improving the way I delegate, for example. Like, I know things are great, but I'm trying to improve how I delegate. Can you give me some feedback on how I'm delegating? And this is where the specific part of the model is helpful. So this is called situational humility, and we teach it in our our whole strategy around psychological safety. And so situational humility is just basically saying, hey, I really need your input in this domain. It's not like I'm not confident overall, but in this domain, I'm really trying to grow and learn. Can you help me? And it's a very, very powerful thing to do that. By the way, we've got a whole solution on psychological safety that we teach. We teach set the stage, invite participation, respond thoughtfully. If you're interested in talking to someone about that, just put the word team in the chat and your company name. Someone will follow up with you. Just put team in the chat. And we'll do a demo for you, show you through the whole psychological safety solution. And the same with Grow. We have a growth mindset solution, still one of our biggest out there. Millions of people are learning this. Put the word grow in your company name if you're interested in that. So asking for feedback is the best performance management tool to focus on. It's the best tool for growing a growth mindset, and it creates a lot of psychological safety. So we think it's a really, really important framework to work on.
And so I know we're bringing our guest in soon, but if you were to say, like, what are the 3 ways to ask for feedback well? What are those 3 key things to take away with?
So I think it's kind of, I've sort of covered it, but it's like ask specifically. So don't just say, can I have some feedback, right? But can I have some feedback about how I'm delegating? Or can I have some feedback about how I run meetings? Or can I have some feedback about my emails or the way I'm structuring everything? Or can I have, so that's the first thing is ask specifically. The second is broadly, lots of people, 3 to 5, at least 3, and the third one is often, like get into the habit of doing this weekly. So specifically, broadly, and often. And then really important to ask for 2 things. What am I doing well that I should build on? And what could I rethink? What am I doing well that I should build on? And what can I rethink? Really, really important. So that way things really work. So yeah, why don't we introduce our special guest? This is a surprise special guest, and as much of a surprise to us as it is to you, because this has been an incredible growth mindset journey for us. Some of you have heard we've been building this solution called Lead. Lead is a 6-month digital experience with all the critical foundations for being a better manager or leader at all levels. So the brain-based skills, whether you're a first-time manager or a CEO, for actually leading better. And it's a phenomenal solution. We have a demo every week on this. And yeah, Tony's just put in the link to Lead. But in building Lead, we were like, wow, it'd be really amazing if there was an AI that you could have a conversation with at any time, like 24/7. What if there was an AI that we sort of powered up with all our models and tools and research and webinars and podcasts, everything. We got huge amount of content. And we started thinking about this about a year ago, and the technology is like really accelerated, and we were actually able to build an AI that you can have a conversation with. And I'm going to show you. We've given this AI a name, and we're going to all ask some questions of it. So think of some questions you'd like to ask the world's smartest leadership coach, because that's what we have joining us right now. He or she or it or they's name. It tends to be a he because we've called him Niles, but you can call it whatever you like. Pronoun. He seems to answer to all pronouns. Niles is a neuro-intelligent leadership enhancement system. So this is about being the best possible leader based on the brain. And this is, you can ask any questions you like. I just ask, what are the 3 ways to ask for feedback well? And think of a question that you might ask Niles about managing yourself, managing your team, motivating people, organizing your team, your business itself, growing your business, thinking about like anything to do with leadership or management. And here's what Niles said: be specific, and then be broad. And he's talking about across learning and growth as well. So let's give Niles some challenges. And by the way, a really challenging question is great. We're trying to find the edges of Niles and challenge Niles. So I'll throw another question while you're thinking, but let's get some questions for Niles in the chat. Could be about feedback. We can ask some questions about feedback, but let's see what comes up for folks. So imagine Niles is powered up with every bit of research we've done, all our models, tools, 15 different programs, everything. What would you like to ask Niles about feedback?
It's getting
How
even
about,
and you've even asked questions that are more outside of work as well, haven't you?
yeah, you can ask about your kids and all sorts of things, that it actually gives you a little disclaimer, but then actually has often a really different.
That's a good question.
I'm going to just put one in while they come in. What does poor performance look like? I should spell it correctly. What does poor performance look like? Let's see what Niles says.
Oh, we're getting some great questions.
Why is empathy important to leadership? We'll try that one next.
Cultures, it's great.
And some good questions. We'll try this one. We'll just give it takes about 20 seconds. How do you influence a culture of feedback when the executives? Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Consistent failure to meet targets, lack of engagement or initiative, ineffective collaboration and communication. And it ties back to different models. And in the version shortly that we'll release, it actually, you'll be able to click on all these different words that are important and kind of dig in more. Let's give us another one. Oh, didn't get it. How to reduce the threat response when giving feedback. Let's try that one. But we'll try some hard ones. Why is empathy important to leadership? We'll try that one next. See what it says. So Niles, so we basically built Niles as a part of the lead solution, but we've had all these companies say to us, actually, we'd love to just have Niles, and people can click into the different words and kind of study, like learn more as they want to get in. And so we're actually going to do that. We're very adaptive, and we're starting to have conversations with organizations about that. Yeah, if you're interested in kind of discussing that, just put the word Niles and your company name in the chat. Someone will reach out. But let's have a look. Increase certainty by setting clear expectations. There we go. Provide autonomy by involving them in the process. Enhance relatedness through empathy and support. There we go. So we've got 3 important things. Oops, let's do a different one. Yeah, just put Niles in the chat. Maybe your company name as well, so we know quickly how to sort of support you. That's interesting. When we grab this one, humility is an important leadership trait. Let's see what Niles says. No, keeps grabbing that. It's not cutting and pasting so easily from Zoom, but we'll fix that. There we go. Some good questions coming in.
Great questions.
Beautiful. Let's see what else comes in. How would you describe the perfect unplanned feedback moment? That's a clever one. Let's try that one and see what happens. There's some really great questions in here. I wish we had time to go through all of them. We've been testing it, and it's actually, the harder the question, the more context it has. In some ways, the better it can do. Actually, I've got a fun one. Write me an email to someone who used to perform well and recently has not been hitting their targets. So this is where Niles kind of starts to excel. We'll see what it says about humility. So we're talking about how to help people understand that humility. So you want to model it, you want to incorporate it into leadership programs. So talking about that, you want to recognize and reward humility practices. There we go. There's some good answers. So now we're going to do something tricky. Write me an email. Well, that's a nice one from Nancy. My leadership style is to be extremely direct. How can I adapt and modify? That's a great one. These are all great questions.
Well, and they're
Yeah,
all
so the idea with the if you don't use a ranking or number for performance review from Sarah, that's the best way. Yeah, all of these are fantastic. We want to do this. Here we go. Certainly. So it's actually quick at answering emails. So there's a little bit of status there. I want to acknowledge your contributions. Giving them some autonomy. So you're actually not having the conversation in text, which is perfect. You never want to give feedback if it's not like difficult feedback that's not verbal. So so it's setting up a conversation in a really nice way. That's well done, Niles. I'll give you a pat on the back. Let's see if we've got another one here. Which one do you want to grab?
Oh man, so many great
Yeah,
questions.
it's Kath. That's exactly right, Kath. It wrote an email to set up a time, giving a little bit of context. Very good. Yeah, no, it's really surprising all of us in some powerful ways. Let's see what other questions.
Well, asking about the humility from Kath is a great question.
Yeah, I did that one earlier. Here we go. How to show up a leader for your team when your own engagement is low and you're not feeling your best. Let's see what. I like giving Niles tough challenges. Oh, nice one from Susan. Please compose for me an elevator speech. So this is one of its strengths, is writing emails for you and composing speeches for you and developing like a presentation or developing a strategy. It absolutely cleans up. Like it does it better than I would do on these things, and really, really thorough. And yeah, you want to put your own voice in it a bit, and you want to tweak it a bit, and you want to make sure it doesn't sound like an AI has written it. But conceptually and strategically, it's really amazing. So we'll see what Niall says about this. Here we go. Leverage transparency and vulnerability. There's the relatedness to mention by being transparent about their own challenges, but in a professional way. Sharing vulnerabilities to an appropriate degree can humanize leaders. Balance transparency with reassurance. That's important. So that's good. Focus on strengths and delegation. Leaning on the strengths of your team can be a practical strategy. That's really nice. Implement and maintain routine check-ins. Yeah, that's really good. We'll do one more before we wrap up. I see the time. I know you all want to spend the day doing this, don't you? There's a simple way of doing that. Put the word Niles in your company name in the chat. Someone will reach out and we'll see if we can do a pilot with you to get this in your hands and in the hands of a few hundred leaders. We're ready to pilot, and it's working like amazingly well. It's kind of spooky. See what Niles says about this one, and powered up with all our so it's a somewhat closed system, so it has a little bit of input, but it's got a lot of our research. And remember, our research is all our conferences since 2008. We've been running a huge international 2 or 3 day conference since then, and a journal with 60 something papers and hundreds of blogs and webinars and podcasts, 15 huge training programs, about another 100 off-the-shelf, custom leadership programs we built. So sort of everything we've ever done in 24 years pretty much is in there, 26 years now, I should say. So it's there's a lot. Here we go. So you can actually, if you're a head of DEI, you can ask like, how do I structure DEI in this political environment? It'll actually give you a really good answer. If you're in, CHRO, like how do I deal with, CHRO issues? The other fun thing I'll say before we wrap is, we are actually seeing that you could weave in your company's mission, vision, purpose, values, and all your HR tools so that people could actually be pointed to your own company's HR tools. There we go. We'll read that. That's pretty crazy awesome. That's pretty crazy awesome. So anyway, that's our surprise guest. How long would it take Niles to produce a whole structured mini course on this topic? Not very long, about 20 seconds. That's what's scary. Now, you might need a human then to deliver it, but in about 20 seconds, it's going to do that, sometimes really fast. So we're kind of disrupting ourselves with this. We don't know where the future's going, but we're having our own growth mindset. Yeah, we'd love any feedback that you're willing to share on this, throw in the chat. We'll stay on for a couple more minutes. But we wanted to today just bring on a special guest of something that we've been really playing with. It is really, really cool. It's blowing my mind, and I've tested it with all sorts of people, and it's really rare that it doesn't have a profoundly helpful answer. So, technology is coming. Let's be the people to leverage it and use it Just, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to share this. A great session. Emma, any closing thoughts before we wrap?
No, this is great. I loved ending this way. We should have special guests more often.
Special guest more often. I don't know if we've got anyone quite as special as Niles yet, but we'll keep doing it. But we'll have to bring Niles in more often. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for a great conversation, Emma. Thanks, Shelby. And yeah, just throw the word Niles and your company name in the chat if you want to have a conversation about it. We can have you play with it and talk about it, and talk through different ways we can pilot it there. So thanks everyone. Take care of yourselves. Look after each other. See you in the next few weeks. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emma and David, for today's conversation. If you're still on, just a few more things. Let us know how we can help you. We'll share our poll to connect with us and work together. We are getting summit planning underway for 2024. We're extremely excited and looking forward to it. So we want to hear from you. We have a summit survey, and we can share that link in the chat for you to share your thoughts and feedback on what we should put together for this year. Our second lead cohort is going to be kicking off on April 18th. So if you're interested in joining that next group, our team can also share that info. And we also have information on our website. It's been a wonderful journey so far, and we're looking forward to moving forward. Insider Exchange, this is specifically for senior executives. So if you enjoy this show, we really think you'll love the Insider program. It's an exclusive opportunity to have roundtable discussions with our internal leaders. So if you are interested in something like that, we will also share that link in the chat. And then hosting an NLI event. So if you want to partner with us to host, we are really looking forward to expanding with our community. If you're interested in your organization working with us, please let us know. Check out the link in the chat as well, and there will be more information on our follow-up. And lastly, the podcast. So if you enjoyed today's episode, you can hear it back and other episodes on our podcast, Your Brain at Work, wherever you listen. And that is officially where we say farewell. So on the behalf of our team behind the scenes, thank you so much for being here every week. We appreciate you. Have a great weekend, and we will see you next week.